Welcome to Gallery Teachers Masterclass. My name is Ania Kolbuszewska, and in the session today, we'll talk about practical ways in which you can integrate assessment for learning into your everyday teaching. Some of you will have already participated in a session led by Neil Harris, in which he was talking about assessment of, for, and as learning. My session today follows on from Neil's session. Having said this, even if you didn't participate in Neil's workshop, you will, I hope, find this session informative and useful. And so at the beginning of the session, we're going to look at what assessment for learning really is, but most of the session is going to be devoted to the practical things that you can do to ensure that assessment for learning is an integral part of the teaching learning process. And we will look at a few categories of strategies and activities. So questions and questioning techniques, marking students' work, setting aims, reviewing learning, and celebrating mistakes. In their book, Why We Assess Students and How, James McLean and Robert Lockwood stress the fact that in order to make assessment a positive force in education, it needs to be used in a way which helps improve education. And so rather than teach to test, we must test what we teach. And what they're suggesting here is, in fact, assessment for learning, which is nothing other than assessing a student's understanding of what it is that we're trying to teach them during the learning and teaching process. Doing this provides us teachers with ongoing feedback and allows us not only to monitor student progress, but also to identify at-risk students early and, very importantly, to adjust our teaching accordingly and immediately. So what exactly is assessment for learning? It's an approach, and very crucially, it's an approach to the whole process of teaching and learning. And in this process, feedback is used to improve teaching and through that to improve students' performance. And the most important benefit of assessment for learning is a higher level of involvement on the part of the students, which leads to a higher level of confidence. So if we want to move from the definition to a description of the process, here is how we carry out assessment for learning. First of all, we need to elicit information from students on the learning process so that we can change how we teach. In later part of this session, we will look at ways in which we can obtain information on the learning process. An important part of the process is giving formative feedback. Formative feedback is the kind of feedback which explains to learners what they have done well and what they need to do in order to make further progress. But in order to give formative feedback, we must use clear and transparent success criteria so that learners know what it is that they're trying to achieve. And these success criteria may be created by the teacher, or they may be created by the students. Those of you who followed my sessions on providing feedback will probably recognize the example that I'm going to use next to talk about success criteria, which are so vital to giving formative feedback. So let's have a look at an example situation of a job interview. Imagine that your students are going to role play a job interview. They work in groups of 3, where A plays the role of the interviewer, B plays the role of the candidate applying for the job, and C is the observer who will then feed back to A and B on their level of success. But of course, C cannot assess the level of success if there is no frame of reference, if they don't know what success looks like. And this frame of reference is provided by assessment criteria. And of course, we can use assessment criteria which have been developed by, for example, an exam board. And what you can see on the screen is an example of assessment criteria used by Cambridge English Language Assessment. But we can also create criteria ourselves, or, as we said earlier, involve students in creating these criteria. And if we decide to do that, if we decide to involve students in creating feedback criteria, the sense of ownership and responsibility will be significantly higher. When developing criteria, the most important thing that we need to look at is what it is that we're trying to achieve in a given activity. And here are some examples of aims. We could be focusing on students' accuracy, and it could be accuracy in one language system or in more than one language system. So, for example, accuracy in terms of grammar, in terms of lexis, in terms of pronunciation. It could also be fluency in speaking. Another possibility would be developing active vocabulary range or active grammar range. Or it could also be developing a range of communicative strategies. For example, the ability to define a word that you don't know or have forgotten and you need in order to communicate successfully. So, if we're working on this particular situation, a job interview, a possible aim could be developing topic-appropriate active vocabulary range. And of course, when we think about a job interview, then probably the lexis will be from the area of education, experience, schools, courses, work experience, voluntary work. Another possible aim would be developing active grammar range. And a key skill which can be practiced in a job interview is, of course, the ability to ask questions. So this was the first component of success, the aim which the students are working on achieving. And what the students are working towards is best expressed using can-do statements. Now, once we have a full picture of what the aim is, we can compare the current performance to what learners are trying to achieve. And of course, the next part of feedback, the next key part of feedback, will be what kind of action needs to be taken in order to move from where a particular learner is at a given moment and to move them in the direction of what they want to achieve. So, where do I go? How am I doing? And what do I do next? And when you look at these questions, you can really see that learning is a journey. You have a destination, and if you use a navigation app, you can see where you are in relation to your destination. And the navigation app will tell you where to go next to reach your destination. And a kind of side effect of doing this is ensuring that students become independent in their learning and that they don't always need the teacher to direct their learning. Now, a few minutes ago, we identified these three actions as the how of assessment for learning. So now that we have very briefly talked about giving formative feedback and clear and transparent success criteria, we need to look at how we can actually get the information on the students' learning process and on their progress in a way which involves and engages them. And also how we can ensure the high level of involvement and focus on the learning in our students. Because this makes them not only active participants in education, but also very aware shapers of their own learning. In other words, let's open the Teacher's Assessment for Learning Toolkit. For practical reasons, I've divided the toolkit into a few sections, which I actually listed for you at the very beginning of my session. And I would like to start with something that we do all the time as teachers, and that is questions. What we will look at here is not how we, the teachers, should ask questions, but what we can do to ensure that the students are interested in asking questions and that they understand the value of questions and know what questions to ask in order to enhance their learning. It seems easy to ask questions, but we know full well that not all questions are good questions, and students might actually need some guidance with asking the right questions. A good place to start will be discussing with students what makes a good question. It is quite likely that during the discussion, the difference between open questions and closed questions will come up. And students need to know that closed questions are actually not very useful in helping them to use abstract thinking skills, in encouraging talking or eliciting understanding. Open questions are much more likely to do this, and in this way to improve learning. But this is not to say that closed questions have no value. A very good exercise to create questions and assess their usefulness for the learning process is a pyramid discussion, with students coming up with questions on a given topic or in a given area. So they can do this individually or in pairs. And so the first step will be brainstorming, and the second step will be evaluating which of the questions that they have come up with are the best. Once they have the best, they team up with another pair and they choose the best for the two pairs. And then the 4 students team up with another 4 students and choose the best questions for this group of 8, and so on. So a classic pyramid discussion. Once the whole class or a larger group or part of the class have come up with their best questions, they all discuss and answer these questions. A very good follow-up would be asking how students chose the best questions. In this way, we focus on the process and make it explicit or visible. When discussing what makes a good question, it's always a good idea to present students with useful question stems. In other words, useful question beginnings. And when you look at these question beginnings, you will see that they are all open questions. So they require a longer, thought through answer. And this in turn requires critical thinking on the part of the students. When you think critically, you ask questions about the reliability of the information that you read or hear. For example, you might want to know where the information comes from, or you could ask what evidence there is for the information provided. And it is widely accepted that the key critical thinking skills are analysis, interpretation, inference, explanation, self-regulation, open-mindedness, and problem solving. And of course, critical thinking skills are directly connected with Bloom's taxonomy. Bloom's taxonomy refers to a classification of learning or educational objectives, and it divides those educational objectives into 3 domains: the cognitive domain, the affective domain, and psychomotor domain. And these are sometimes very loosely described as knowing, or the head, feeling, or the heart, and doing, or hands. And within these domains, learning at the higher level is always dependent on having attained the necessary knowledge and skills at lower levels. And of course, in Bloom's taxonomy, critical thinking comes under the cognitive domain. So if we look at the triangle that I'm sure you're all familiar with, you will see that at the base of the triangle, we have what are called foundation thinking skills. And then higher up, we have higher order critical thinking skills. And of course, we must remember that they come under the cognitive domain. So we could, in fact, present Bloom's taxonomy in this way. Those of you who are particularly interested in developing critical thinking skills in your students, here is a great workbook of games and activities for developing critical thinking skills. And you can find this workbook on the Global Digital Citizen Foundation website. But let's go back to our focus, which is questions and questioning techniques. Generally speaking, it's always a good idea to involve students in creating and asking their own questions. And that's because knowledge and understanding come from curiosity, and that is demonstrated through questions we ask. Also, critical thinking, which we have just talked about, is developed through asking questions. And students could be encouraged to ask questions about what it is that they would like to know about a new topic. And they could be encouraged to ask questions to assess their learning. And these questions could be directed to the teacher or to their classmates. And they could be encouraged to ask questions to demonstrate learning or to demonstrate interesting misconceptions, which they would like to explore. In fact, one of the things that you could do is have a questions box where students throw their questions at the end of the lesson. And these questions will serve as a fantastic resource for reviewing learning in the following lesson or lessons. Instead of asking a question that requires factual reference or remembering facts, invert it to encourage explicit reasoning. And a very good example is when analyzing a written task with clear specifications, such as, for example, in Cambridge exams. Now, it is, of course, a very good idea to check if the students see if the candidate has or hasn't completed the task. But it's a much more fuller learning experience when we start probing and get students to verbalize what it is that makes a task complete. And this moves them from seeing just one example to understanding the principle and the pattern, and in this way, to being able to analyze other tasks on their own. Also, devise questions that challenge common misconceptions, that create conflict or require discussion, that explore ambiguity and encourage discussion and clarification. There are a lot of areas in English language teaching as a profession where misconceptions exist. And one of them is the notion that native speaker teachers might be better and that students want to be taught by the so-called native speaker teachers. And this is a topic which I very often discuss with my own students and trainees. And one of the questions that I ask them is this: the majority of people learning English in the world are taught by the so-called non-native teachers of English. Does this mean that they are getting a worse deal and they don't learn as much? Now, of course, the native versus non-native debate is a very hot topic in ELT at the moment. But it is a huge area, which merits its own session, so we're not going to discuss it here. Okay, so we have spent some time looking at questions and questioning techniques and how these can engage students and encourage them to use critical thinking skills. Questions and questioning techniques are not separate from other strategies and techniques. In fact, they are very often underlying other strategies. Now, the next category which I would like us to examine is how we can make marking student work a developmental experience in the sense of assessment for learning. When making comments on students' work, treat these comments like guidance, showing how the student can improve. And perhaps you can start it off by discussing the notion of guidance and how guidance differs from other types of behavior, such as prescription or admonition. Comment-only marking provides students with a focus on progression instead of a focus on a reward or punishment, which is exactly what a grade does. Comments could be made in books, in notebooks, or in a learning diary or journal. And a learning diary is very helpful for both the teacher and the students because it allows for tracking the progression of comments and to see improvement. Comments should make it clear how the students can improve. And this is where we go back to criteria, which are in turn related to aims. When setting students a piece of work, show them examples that make it clear what it is that they're asked to do and what they need to do in order to meet the assessment criteria. Students could mark this example work using assessment criteria, and this will provide them with a model of what it is that the task requires and how it relates to the process of assessment. And again, make sure that what you comment on relates to the aim of the activity or the task, that it includes very clear indication of what the student's progress relative to the aim is, and what exactly they need to do in order to progress or to progress faster. One of the more powerful techniques for learning to write well is redrafting. And it might be a very good idea to use lesson time for students to redraft the work that you have commented on. This allows students the time and the space to really focus on the feedback that you have been giving them and to ask questions if there's something that's not entirely clear for them. And of course, they can ask their peers or they can ask the teacher. So the teacher can make it a one-to-one discussion with one particular student, or they can make it into a class discussion if the issue raised would be of interest to the whole class. So redrafting in class reinforces the value of the feedback and allows students to work in a supportive environment. You can reinforce the focus on redrafting and comment-only marking by insisting on seeing evidence that students have actually corrected their own work before you agree to look at it. But of course, you will have to allow extra time for this. An equally valuable and even more engaging of providing feedback is getting students themselves to either mark their classmates' work or to mark their own work according to assessment criteria. And this could be done in pairs or individually with criteria which have been produced by the students themselves or generated by the teacher and communicated to students. Now, a very clear benefit of students taking the lead role in the process of assessment is that they gain a much deeper understanding of the topics, the process of assessment, and what it is that they are doing in their own work. And this helps them to become more aware of the complexity of the learning process itself, and in this way, to be able to make their own learning visible. When talking about assessment for learning, we must not forget about the ever important area of aims. And we have in fact mentioned aims a number of times when we talked about assessment criteria. To see the connection between the progress that they're making now and the big picture, students should set both short and long-term goals. The short-term goals could be reviewed weekly or fortnightly, and the long-term goals could be reviewed, for example, at the end of the term, at the end of the year, at the end of the course. Having a long-term goal may give more importance to the students' and teachers' short-term goals, and it may also allow students to focus on what really motivates them in learning English. But of course, aims need to be shared with students and discussed with them. And one of the ways of doing it will be putting lesson objectives on the board at the beginning of the lesson, or putting the objectives for the week on a notice board, or objectives for the semester or for the whole course. Also, talking to students about why they're studying and what it is they're actually studying. And by showing the relationship between the short-term aims and the long-term aims. But also, you need to simply check with students that they are clear about the aims of the lesson, unit, week, or course. Producing aims in conjunction with students is also an excellent idea. And similarly, students can give themselves targets based on their self-assessment. And these learning goals could be recorded somewhere and revisited. Now, our next focus is going to be reviewing learning. And I don't need to remind anyone of how important review is and what difference it makes in terms of retention of what students have learned. A traditional way of conducting review is when the teacher leads the review of the lesson or the unit, checking understanding among students. But the focus could also be on the effectiveness of the lesson. So, for example, students would be encouraged to think about ways in which lessons could be adapted to help them learn better. But we can also put the responsibility for reviewing what they have learned on the students' shoulders. So students review their learning either in groups or individually. This could be done as a plenary, a mini plenary, or as an activity in groups to help planning for future learning. As teachers, we need information on how well students are doing in their learning. And this is also a review of learning, but of a slightly different type. And there are, of course, a number of very quick, fun, and very engaging ways in which you can collect feedback from students on their learning. Thumbs up, thumbs down, and I'm sure you know this technique, and I'm sure some of you have already used it. And here you check class understanding of what you're teaching by asking students to show you their thumbs. And of course, thumbs up means I get it. Thumbs halfway, I sort of get it. And thumbs down, I really don't understand. When revising a topic or a subject, work through different areas with students and ask them to use traffic light colors according to their understanding of the area discussed. And this really helps students focus on the areas which they need to work on more and to study in a much more targeted and focused way. Another activity is talk partners, and this could be used either as a warmer, for example, or at the end of the lesson. So students share with a partner, for example, 3 things that they have learned, what they have found easy or what they have found difficult in the lesson, or something that they would like to learn in the future based on what they have learned today. And the last technique that I would like to show you is called a minute paper. So students identify the most significant, useful, meaningful, unlikely thing that they have learned during the lesson or unit and write about it for a minute. One thing that we really must mention when we talk about assessment for learning is self-evaluation. And I'd just like to clarify very quickly. Self-evaluation involves evaluating how we learn, whereas self-assessment is about what we learn. Now, to train students in self-evaluation, you could use questions such as, what happened when you were learning, when learning took place? What really made you think? What did you find difficult? What do you need more help with? What are you pleased about? What new things have you learned about something? And a very good way of giving students opportunities to self-evaluate is to encourage them to create and use a learning journal in which they can reflect and review their learning. An essential part of learning to self-evaluate is being able to say if my own work is good or not. And the best way is, of course, to involve students in a discussion. So Spend time ensuring that there is a consensus between yourself and the students over what makes a piece of work good and how they are expected to achieve this. So you can use questions such as, what makes a piece of work good? How do I know that my work is good? How do you feel about comments that somebody makes on your work? Do you always know what you need to do next or what to think about? And for homework, you can ask students to find the best piece of work and then present it and tell you why it is their best. Now, to be able to do this, students need to refer to a set of their own success criteria. And so this will give you a valuable input and insight into the aspects of learning which are important for them. One of the most persistent misconceptions in learning is that a mistake is a bad thing. Now, we're not going to explore reasons why this is. We just need to be aware that the misconception is very prevalent among teachers and among students. And we need to work very hard with our students to make sure that they see mistakes as an opportunity to learn, and that without mistakes, there is no learning. And one of the ways in which you can do this is by using incorrect answers as a discussion point. So rather than dismissing something because it's wrong, use this misconception or mistake to analyze the thinking process behind it. And in this way, you help students improve a line of reasoning which is faulty, but even more importantly, you help create an atmosphere in which it is okay to be wrong. And finally, whatever you do, give students time. In other words, wait a little. Wait time allows students time to think and to produce answers with much more confidence. Also, we need to remember that not everyone in class thinks at the same speed or in the same way. So waiting allows students to explore what has been asked and to put their thoughts into words. And there are two main types of wait time. The first one is when the teacher speaks and then waits before the students respond. And the second is when students respond, they end their response, and then the teacher waits a little bit before responding. And this gives students space to either elaborate or continue, or for another student to respond. Now, to summarize what we have talked about, I'm actually going to use wait time. So I'd like you to take a piece of paper and a pen. Can you remember some of the categories or strategies that we talked about that we can use to integrate assessment for learning into our teaching? Perhaps you remember them all. I'm going to give you a little bit of time to write down the categories that you remember. Okay, ready? So the categories that we have looked at were questions and questioning techniques, critical thinking, marking student work, setting aims, reviewing learning, and celebrating mistakes. And finally, I would like to encourage you to check out the Gallery Teachers Workshop website, which provides you with a very useful range of resources relating to teaching and which gives you tools for further professional development. Assessment for learning can help improve education in many different ways, but assessment for learning is a bit of a tricky name, because it includes the word assessment, which teachers and students often automatically associate with tests as we know them. In other words, students having to prove that they have learned something and that they can remember it and retrieve it in a very artificial situation that a test or exam really is. But when we're talking about assessment for learning, we're talking about taking stock, about helping the student and the teacher see how much progress they have made and what are the areas where perhaps students need to work a little bit more to achieve goals which have been set. So what we do when we practice assessment for learning is looking at the process of learning and the goals which have been set, and we see how we can tweak what we do in the classroom and how we can help students in the learning in order to make this learning more effective, but also more motivating and less stressful. In this way, assessment for learning is contributing to changing the image of education to an enjoyable, motivating, and generally positive experience, which helps everyone achieve their real potential. I believe that a widespread use of assessment for learning can change the lives of thousands and thousands of students who cannot fit into today's model of education, who suffer and hate school. Learning is exciting, and assessment for learning is helping us all to see it as such. Assessment for learning has got many visible benefits. It's a very positive and motivating concept because it looks at what students can do instead of focusing on what students cannot do and punishing them for coming up short on expectations, which is unfortunately very often the case with tests and exams. Secondly, assessment for learning recognizes that learners differ in their tempo of learning and in learning strategies. And it provides space for the teacher and for the students to adjust the process to that. It also teaches learners to communicate their learning needs and makes them open to talking about things that they need to work on. And at the same time, it helps change the perspective on mistakes from something that students should be punished for, and so something that needs to be avoided at all cost, to one of the most valuable helpers in the process of learning. Assessment for learning shows our students that they can be in charge of their own learning. And this is a real shift in terms of balance of power in education. The teacher is no longer the only decision maker as the only person who has knowledge. Assessment for learning recognizes that learners have the ability for introspection and for communicating their needs. And yes, it's the teacher who has the subject knowledge and methodology skills. But to best use them, the teacher listens to the learner, who becomes the center of the teaching learning process.